Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in Canada to rally support from his close ally as Kyiv's forces push ahead in their counteroffensive against Russia. This is Mr Zelenskyy's first visit to Canada since the war began in February last year. He landed in Ottawa late last night on an unannounced visit following his trip to Washington. The Ukrainian president and his wife were met by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The leaders will be holding talks today. Mr Zelenskyy is also due to address the Canadian Parliament before heading to Toronto together with Mr Trudeau to meet business leaders and members of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. Nick Harper joins us live now from Washington, D.C. for more on this story. Nick, what is the extent of Ottawa's support for Ukraine, and what are the expectations in that respect for Mr Zelenskyy for his trip?
Well, Dawn, we've certainly seen that warm welcome for Mr Zelenskyy as he stepped off the plane, being warmly greeted by Justin Trudeau. We are expecting that we will see continued commitments of support from Canada during the course of this trip. Prime Minister Trudeau has already said we have a huge and deep ties with that country in friendship and values. And over the course of the last 18 months during this conflict, we have seen that play out. Canada is one of Ukraine's top financial backers. They've given $6 billion of support so far, humanitarian and military support. On the military side of things, they've given weaponry, tanks, light armoured vehicles. They've also trained Ukrainian soldiers in Europe as well. And part of this is because there is that connection at the heart of Canadian society with Ukraine. The fact that Mr Zelenskyy will be taking part in an event with Ukrainian Canadian citizens, I think, demonstrates that. About 4% of the Canadian population identifies as Ukrainian. They're of Ukrainian descent. That's about 1.4 million people in total, including the Deputy Prime Minister. Her mother was Ukrainian. And we've also seen Canada offer support for refugees fleeing the country during this war. 175,000 have been allowed to enter Canada. Another 700,000 have been approved to enter the country as well. So lots of fellow feeling, but we're likely to see perhaps commitments, but certainly warm wishes and support coming from Canada during the course of this visit.
Nick, there has been a sharp contrast between this visit to Canada and the one that Mr Zelenskyy made to the United States. Why was the Ukrainian president's second wartime visit to Washington so much tougher than his first?
Yeah, real light and shade between these two visits, and also a huge contrast to Mr Zelenskyy's visit to the United States last December. There was a very warm welcome. You may remember he gave a joint address to Congress. He had a 2-minute standing ovation. But this time around, his Thursday trip to Washington was much frostier, and a lot of that is to do with timing. It all comes at a moment when both houses on Capitol Hill are trying to agree extra funding to prevent a government shutdown. We're just a week away from that happening. Now, President Biden, during Zelenskyy's trip, announced an extra $325 million of funding for Ukraine, but he has asked Congress to approve $24 billion, and they're not happy with that. Some hardline Republicans saying that they simply want to cut off all funding for Ukraine. And Ukraine, in many ways, is now being used as a bargaining chip in these negotiations to prevent the government shutdown. The possibility is that all funding for Ukraine will be stripped out of the package just so a bill is passed before the government shutdown happens at the end of this month. So bad timing for Mr Zelenskyy this time around when there are those internal politics very much at large in Washington at the moment.
All right, Nick, thank you very much for that. Nick Harper there in Washington, D.C.